Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Emily Riley. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program. I'm a white woman with auburn curly hair. I'm wearing a green shirt, and I'm sitting in my office right now beside a window with a little bit of a mess behind me of books and drawings. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that we're hosting this event from. And I say this acknowledgement aware that these kinds of statements can be misused as stand-ins for actual decolonization work, which is something for us all to bear in mind as we go forward in our ongoing commitment to accountability, reparation, and equity. Many cities and institutions in America were founded on the exclusion, harm, and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land, Mannahatta, from which we are hosting this event. The land of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City is the unceded territory of the Lenape, Merrick, Canarsie, Matinecock, and Rockaway nations. Despite systemic erasures, these lands persist as intertribal trade lands under the stewardship of many nations and over 115,000 intertribal Native American, First Nation, and Indigenous peoples who currently call New York City home. If you'd like to learn more about the land that you may be on, you can click on the link that will be posted in the chat momentarily. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge those whose ancestors did not arrive on these lands of their own free will and whose tremendous cultural, economic, and technological contributions continue to provide the foundations for our lives. So welcome. We are joined today by Selena from Pro Bono ASL. Selena and her colleague Susan will be switching on and off, and they'll be providing American Sign Language interpretation for this event. So welcome Selena and Susan, and thank you to Pro Bono ASL. If you'd like to initiate closed captioning, you can do that at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button that has 2 C's inside of it. You can choose to view the transcription there. This event will be recorded and it will post it to BGC's YouTube channel in November. You can also go to our YouTube channel for past lectures and conversations as well. So we invite you to submit questions throughout the program as they come up for you using the Q&A function, which is again at the bottom of the screen. We'll be using the chat for just appreciations and thank yous, but if you have a question and you want it to be answered, submit it through the Q&A function. There'll be a little time at the end for us to address those questions. And finally, you can learn more about BGC's events in the link that we'll post in the chat momentarily. This program is a series of 5 programs organized, inspired by our Majolica Mania exhibition, which is a weird and wonderful explosion of color that you can view in our gallery on the Upper East Side in New York. There's also a great online exhibition for those of you who are joining us who cannot come to New York right now. We have some upcoming events, the Histories of Lead Activism in America in early November, and a poetry reading by a group of poets who were commissioned by BGC to create poems in response to objects in the exhibition. We'll also be posting a link in the chat to the catalog, which is a tome of a publication. It's an object in and of itself. It's a very beautiful series of 3 books, and obviously the exhibition as well, the digital exhibition, excuse me. We'll also post in the link how you can see this exhibition, so timed entry links and things like that. But thank you for being here. It's really a pleasure to join on the eve of Halloween, if you like, or not the eve, but the eve of the Halloween weekend for this program. Our 2 speakers today are Dr. Spike Bucklow, who's a professor of material culture at the Hamilton Kerr Institute at the University of Cambridge, where he's taught the conservation of paintings for 20 years. And Dr. Jennifer L. Mass, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Cultural Heritage Science at Bard Graduate Center. They both have many accolades. I'm not going to read them all right now because we want to get to the meat of the conversation, but we will post a link so you can read their full bios if you're curious momentarily. In terms of the format of today, in just a moment, I'm going to hand the mic over to Jennifer, who will start us off with a presentation. And then Spike will respond, and there'll be some conversation, and then we'll open it up to the floor for conversations as well. So thank you for being here. I'm now going to pass it over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Spike, for joining us as well. The confluence of the Majolica exhibit and Halloween coming up, it gives us a wonderful opportunity to talk about the magnificent colors of Majolica and other artist materials, and take a look at a little bit of the dark side of these materials. So it turns out that the most magnificent colors, many of which we see in Majolica, but also in paintings and other decorative arts, we know now that they are actually deadly poisons. And so unfortunately, in the time we have today, we had to pick 3 to focus on. So we're going to focus on uranium, arsenic, and lead, but we could equally have told fascinating stories about all of these other elements. And out of all of them, I have to say that thallium is probably the most toxic pigment that I've ever worked with. It's called the poisoner's poison because it is odorless and tasteless and very difficult to detect, but it makes a very beautiful orange color. So throughout the periodic table, we have these elements that are exceptionally beautiful and exceptionally bad for us. So why? This seems like such a strange thing that all of these materials that are so beautiful are so tremendously toxic. And it turns out that Mother Nature is really not thinking about us. And if you look at the most toxic materials in the world, they're actually not the inorganic materials that Spike and I are focusing on today. Instead, they're plants, materials like the deadly nightshade or the castor bean plant, which is the source of the deadly poison ricin. Okay, so I wanted to go through the chemistry of some of the most important artist pigments and the most toxic materials that have ever been invented. And I highlighted arsenic and lead and chromium here because these are really the most prevalent one. If you look just at arsenic, there's an absolute rainbow of colors that you can get out of all of the different arsenic pigments that are available to artists. And likewise with chromium, and the name chromium is actually based on the word for color because there are so many magnificently colored chromium compounds. In the case of lead, lead is ubiquitous, not so much because it makes so many different pigments, but because lead white is a component of so many artist materials up until in the United States, 1978, when it finally gets outlawed. Some of these you don't run into very often. The cadmium colors were extremely popular in their day. Thorium glazes were used. I couldn't even find an image of a thorium glaze for this presentation, so they were pretty rare. Likewise, I've only run into thallium chromate once, thank God. So I wanted to think about, of all of these magnificent but deadly materials, where they actually show up in the artist's palette. And it turns out that the yellows and the reds are really not looking so good. That's where the predominant amount of the toxic elements are located. But there's some problems with the arsenic-based greens, which we'll talk about today, and also chromium and uranium-based greens as well. Lead, as an extremely important white historically, is in almost all paints historically, again, up until the end of the 1970s. And the blues wind up being kind of a safe zone, except for the fact that it turns out that they're really quite expensive and unstable. And so for the vast majority of artists, through the vast majority of history, they're going to be working with these very, what we now understand to be these very dangerous materials. So if you take a look at the aesthetic era interior and what's going on in the second half of the 19th century that leads to this magnificent decoration. And I realize that people have strong reactions to these rooms. Some people would call them over decoration. I think that they're wonderful. But one of the things that happens is the invention of gaslight, that all of a sudden, now that you don't need only candlelight or an oil lamp, you have the possibility to play with dark colors in the interior. And so a wider palette gets to be explored. And then also, of course, the Industrial Revolution is a revolution in both inorganic and organic chemistry that causes just an explosion in the artist's palette. But it turns out that many of these new materials that were invented during the Industrial Revolution are either toxic or in some cases, both radioactive and toxic. So poisonous pigment number one is the lead that's used in Majolica glazes. And when we think about Majolica, we often think about this incredible juxtaposition of just these amazing colors, but there's something else going on here. The depth and the sparkle of the color is provided for these wares by using an extremely high lead oxide content in the glaze. So it's impossible to think about Majolica without focusing on color, but it really is not just color, it's also color and shine. And I'm really drawn to the wares in the exhibit from the George Jones factory, because I feel like he is really making the most out of the possibilities with all of these new pigments and these new technological innovations that are introduced in Stoke-on-Trent. And I just love that little cow up on the right. And then Minton, of course, does an amazing job exploring and exploiting these new technologies to the fullest, even in just this one form, the oyster plate. And in the fabulous catalog for the exhibit, Miranda Goodby does a terrific job of talking about the fearful malady of the clay and the working conditions of the 19th century Staffordshire potteries. And I always think it's interesting to look at the juxtaposition of the beautiful objects with the conditions in which the objects were being made. Of course, with all of these furnaces going at the same time in Staffordshire, there's a tremendous amount of pollution generated by the fuel, the coal, the fact that the furnaces are coal-fired. And then also during the 19th century, we have to confront that child labor was heavily used. And one thing that I was really shocked to find out about is that the children were actually given the most dangerous jobs. I had assumed that they were given very small jobs to go along with small people, but no, they got dangerous jobs and the lowest pay, and they even got beatings if they didn't perform up to standard. And so the entire notion of childhood was so different then than it is today. Probably the most dangerous job was the glaze dipper, and you can see his boy assistants on the right in the image. So without any protective clothing, they're actually dipping their entire arms into lead oxide containing solution for very long hours. And so this could be a 6-day work week with 72 hours per week. Some children started working as young as the ages of 5 or 6 to help support their families, and they're doing the dirtiest and the hottest work. And one thing that Miranda mentions in her essay is that the potteries actually offered better conditions than other industries, which is a little bit scary to think about. And there's really no regulation of child labor in England until the 1860s. So there were girl laborers as well as boy laborers. And so they're working in this very cramped, hot, polluted environment. And there's women working in the factories as well as men. But of course, since it's the 19th century, women are not eligible for the more skilled jobs and hired paying jobs, such as being a presser or a turner. And it's not until the 1870s that children are required to attend school. And even then, it's not, they only have to go to school until the age of 10, and then they join their parents in the factories. So there's about 1,000 pottery kilns that are operating in Staffordshire during the height of the production of Majolica. And the coal soot from all of these furnaces is really having devastating health consequences on the population, not just in terms of the carbon-containing soot, the visible part, but also all of the heavy metals that are found in coals. In particular, mercury is a big problem. And then making this type of pottery is actually a very dust-producing industry as well. And so whether you're doing casting or throwing, or even just before you're putting the pots into the sagger, you're putting down a layer of ground flint so that the bottom of the piece of pottery doesn't stick to the sagger. That ground flint is pure silica, which causes silicosis. And the worst job of all, unfortunately, is the people that were in charge of scouring off all the flaws, basically sanding off the edges of the pot. And the dust was described as the greatest enemy to the health of the operative. And so being exposed to all of that silica dust would cause silicosis. And of course, being exposed to the dried lead glaze dust would cause lead poisoning. I think it's particularly interesting to read it in this one volume, The Voices of the Potteries, from the workers' perspectives in terms of them coming down with what was called at the time potter's asthma or potter's consumption. And doctors at the time were really shocked by the endemic lung disease among the potters and didn't fully understand the causes. And everyone's very pragmatic about their lives. And so one of the workers is saying, when there was smoke, there was work. When there was no smoke, there was no work. And so you have this very cut and dried attitude that we need to be employed. This is the employment that was available. Another one of the workers talks about the pollution being like black cotton wool. And then there's a tremendous amount of fascinating labor history in the Staffordshire Potteries as well. And in one pro-union pamphlet, The Life and Death of a Working Potter, one of the potters talks about coughing all night and coughing all morning, but still going to work just the same. And in the West, it's hard to imagine that attitude, but unfortunately, if we think about how people's working conditions or what their working conditions are like in India or Bangladesh or in Southeast Asia, this attitude would not be so unusual today. So here we see the women painters working on Majolica in the potteries in around the 1860s. They would point their brushes with their lips, and unfortunately, this would expose them to glazes that had exceptionally high lead oxide contents, up to 60% versus the 33% that was common for other types of wares made at the potteries. But also, in addition to the lead, all of the heavy metals that were used to make the magnificent colors that we see from Majolica would be ingested by the women painters as well. Unfortunately, the attitude of the factory supervisors was much the same as we see today. And here's one saying, "It is the fault of the workmen if they do not clean themselves." And so it's really very much a blame the victim philosophy. And we have a quote here from a ground layer. So he's working with the silica powder and being exposed to silicosis and talking about they know that it affects their lungs and that the nature of their work is pernicious. And a quote from one of the scourers and talking about getting the Majolica wares out of the oven in a dusty and rough state, and that their business is then to use sandpaper to smooth down the edges. And specifically, she says, this occupation is very unhealthy. Not many scourers live long. It takes some off sooner than others. Again, totally matter of fact, really kind of shocking from the 21st century perspective. And another look at a quote from a glaze dipper talking about the dangers of children working among the lead glaze and the possibility for lead poisoning. And the factory owners, again, they blame the workers, saying that they had careless and dirty and slovenly habits. But I'm showing some images from milk being handed out at Minton on the right. Minton would give their employees milk in order to line their stomachs to try and slow down the lead absorption while they worked. Poisonous pigment number 2 is arsenical greens that we're going to see were phenomenally popular during the same time that Majolica was popular in the second half of the 19th century. So as I showed earlier, arsenic really can create just a rainbow of different amazing pigments, but I wanted to focus on arsenic greens because they are by far the most prevalent pigments when it comes to arsenic in the artist's palette. So Scheele's green is invented by Wilhelm Scheele in 1775. This is the first arsenic-based green, and it really doesn't have much of a presence in the artist's palette. It quickly becomes overtaken by, actually in 1814, by emerald green, which rather than being copper arsenite is copper acetoarsenite and makes this incredibly beautiful kind of acidy green color that you can really see well in the bookbinding that I'm showing here. And so this pigment was popular for all different kinds of interior decoration, incredibly popular in fashion as well. And in food, it was used as a green color in candies, which is kind of amazing to think about. In food wrappers, in candles, children's toys. And so this is really a ubiquitous material. And when you think about why green was so popular during the height of the Industrial Revolution, it becomes this sort of romantic ideal of worshiping nature, trying to bring the outdoors back in at a time when people were getting more and more divorced from their natural environments and moving to the cities. And it wasn't like the information about the toxicity of these materials was not known in the 19th century. It was just that the attitude towards capitalism in England in the 19th century was a little bit different, maybe not a whole lot different than it is today. So taking a look at the arsenic greens, they're highly toxic. They're actually sometimes deadly and just enormously fashionable. And so emerald green predominantly is going to be showing up everywhere in fashion, whether it's going to be fabrics or gloves or shoes, feathers, or hair ornaments. And so there's a rainbow of these new man-made colors that come along in the second half of the 19th century, and women are participating in this revolution through fashion. I wanted to also point out something here that makes my work and Spike's work sometimes kind of difficult, the fact that when a pigment is so popular, it gets so many different names in the literature. And so you can see from all of these different names for emerald green, what a ubiquitous material it was. So arsenic poisoning was unfortunately incredibly prevalent for the women and children that made artificial flowers from the 1840s to the 1870s. And so this is probably the most dangerous job of all of the arsenic, all of the jobs that would put you in contact with these arsenic pigments. And so you can see, again, sort of this return to naturalism in these beautiful floral headdresses. But in 1859, there was an investigation of these women falling ill in the flower making workshops. And the investigators described a toxic green dust that was floating through the air and the caustic effect that it would have on the women's skin, even producing sores, some of which are documented in the medical drawings below. And sometimes the artificial flower makers would pass away even by the age of 17. And you can see at the bottom right that this isn't just work that was done in factories or workshops, but women would actually bring this work into their homes and have their children help with it as well. In the second half of the 19th century, an analytical chemist actually analyzes some of the leaves from a hair ornament and writes an article from the London Times that he calls The Dance of Death. And he notes that the average ornament contained enough arsenic to poison 20 people, and that 4 to 5 grains of arsenic is a lethal dose, and 1 grain is equivalent to about 15 grams or so. And this really gives you an overview here of how the pigment was used in fashion. And so tremendously popular, not only in women's dresses, but also girls' dresses and children's clothing overall. And then to give a sense of the potential scope of the problem, One green ball dress was found to contain up to half of its weight in arsenic, 900 grains or 58 grams of arsenic, where 4 to 5 grains is a lethal dose for an adult. So people start to take notice of this, and Punch gets into the act with a cartoon about the arsenic waltz as being a dance with death. And the waltz was signaled out basically because it brought the man and woman in close contact. And so men, not just women now, would be in danger when they were dancing with the women wearing this arsenic-based fashion. And there was actually public warnings and instructions for men about how to navigate courting women wearing these poisonous green dresses. And the health problems of the florists and who made the ornaments soon became public knowledge, but free enterprise and capitalism wins out over human health. The Bada Shoe Museum did a whole exhibition on this arsenic problem in fashion victims, their exhibit that looks at all kinds of health problems with the fashion industry. And so some of the shoes for their exhibit are shown here, which are just wonderful. The unfortunate children's clothing, as well as the clothing for adults. And I love the image on the right and the way it shows that literally from just head to toe, you would accessorize with these arsenic green pigments, including even the parasol that you would hold over your head. And arsenic green was actually phenomenally popular in painting from this period as well. And the arsenic greens, I should mention, were popular from their invention up until about the 1950s. And so there's several major artist movements that are impossible to imagine without these pigments, including Expressionism. And Van Gogh in particular was enamored of emerald green. Arsenic green was used by the Expressionists, by the Impressionists, and we do in our work a lot of looking at it under the microscope, in which it makes these beautiful round forms called spirulites that are even more beautiful under the electron microscope. And so both macroscopically and microscopically, an amazingly beautiful material. And there's so much of the art of the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century that we wouldn't have without it. It was so ubiquitous that it was used also, for example, by the Pre-Raphaelites, as I'm showing here, this wonderful image of Mary Magdalene, as well as by the artists that we associate with the end of the 19th century, such as Paul Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Monet. Here's a look at Cézanne, the 5 bathers that I was involved with analyzing for the Barnes Foundation. And so here's a visible light image of this wonderful painting. And then here's an X-ray map of the painting, where at the top right, we're looking at the arsenic distribution, and the bottom right, we're looking at the copper distribution. And so you can see that the entire green background of the painting is done with this arsenic-rich emerald green. And there's just one little slash of viridian that's indicated by the presence of chromium. And so by using X-rays, we can actually map out what artists of pigment or what pigments an artist was using in different parts of a composition. Gauguin was also a tremendous fan of this bright color. And in Manet, we find one of the rare examples of Scheele's green used in the end of the 19th century. And it turns out it's not really the paintings that's a problem, it's the wallpapers that were behind the paintings. They're extremely dangerous. And the reason for this is that the arsenic pigments that were in the wallpapers would react with the glue and with mold spores in a damp environment, and they would release deadly arsenic gas into the air. We find that these arsenic-based wallpapers are exceptionally prevalent during the arts and crafts period, especially coming from the designer William Morris. And these wallpapers were first flagged as a health concern by the late 1830s, so fairly early on, once a test for arsenic was discovered. And after that, it helped the public to identify the presence of arsenic and even to prosecute some manufacturers. So you can see William Morris did some amazingly beautiful things with these pigments. And so I wanted to point that out, and also that it's not only the greens in his wallpapers that are based in arsenic. There's a lot of other arsenic containing pigments in his wallpapers too. But William Morris himself, even though he liberally uses arsenic pigments, he never accepts that arsenic might be harmful. And it turns out that this might be because he was the partial owner of an arsenic mine. And he's quoted in 1885 as saying, "It's hardly possible to imagine a greater folly than the arsenic scare." And so he's really trying to say that this is absolutely not a result of his wallpaper. And he talks about the doctors being bitten by a kind of witch fever in terms of blaming his wallpaper for making people sick. And instead, he's trying to really confuse the conversation and divert the discussion into another direction. And he blames sewer gases from the newfangled toilet drains as making people sick. And he never acknowledges that the workmen in his factories are suffering. And so, or as the Independent put it, how William Morris betrayed his socialist ideals with his wallpaper. And so really, we have to view him as being more of a capitalist than a socialist. And it turns out that wallpaper actually was responsible for killing some children. There was a case in 1862 of a very light green wallpaper in London that wound up being installed in a children's bedroom. And they died being exposed to 3 grains of arsenic per square foot. And when you think about 4 grains as being lethal to an adult, you can get a sense of the problem. So the manufacturers pivoted and they started selling Paris green, which is another name for emerald green, in the 20th century as a pesticide. And they even advertise it as being a quick death. And so it's a case of figuring out what your material is good for and marketing it appropriately. The third poisonous pigment that I wanted to talk about is uranium oxide. Uranium is discovered in the late 18th century, and by 1831, the first uranium glass has been made. And so uranium is used in glasses and glazes and enamels of a broad range of colors, not just the orange that we think of in the Fiesta ware or the green that we think of in Vaseline glass. The first publication of uranium as a pigment is in 1834. And after that, the technology rapidly spreads throughout Europe and the Americas and Asia. So if we look at the categories in which uranium glass is used, basically it's every category in which glasses and ceramics are used, from tablewares to architectural wares to more intimate materials like buttons and jewelry. And I'm showing just 2 examples here of how beautiful these wares can be and the incredible colors that you can get, especially combined with the Art Nouveau movement. It works really well. The technology first comes up in Bohemia, which of course we know was an incredibly important glass center in the second half of the 19th century. And we see 2 different colors, an Anagelb and an Anagrün, being used that contain uranium. And you can't identify that there's uranium in a glass object just by looking at the color. And so we tend to associate uranium glass with this acidy green color that you see for the goblet in the center, but in fact, you can get a wide range of greens, as you see here. These are all uranium glasses. And uranium glasses really become a staple of the Biedermeier decor, and we get a lot of these amber colored glasses like you see here, in addition to yellow. I thought it was particularly ironic to have in an apothecary jar medicine being stored in a uranium-based glass. Basically, every important French glass house got into the act, and so we see some phenomenal Art Nouveau pieces being made with uranium glass. And Lalique, especially in the Art Deco period, is really drawn to this magnificent green glass. Baccarat makes its cutwares also with uranium-based yellows and greens. And so at the top right, I want to point out that's a view of the object in ultraviolet light. So it's an ultraviolet that you really see that fluorescent green color. And that's one way to identify that you have uranium in an object. Thomas Webb, in his incredible cameo wares in England, we see him using uranium glass as the base for the cameo. And then William Morris in his stained glass uses these magnificent yellows and greens as well. And the Burmese ware, also made by Thomas Webb, where you've got these wonderful combinations of the pink with the acidy yellow green. And it's that acidy yellow green, again, that's the uranium. And then Victorian England really kind of goes nuts with this material, and they make all of these amazing marmalades and jellies that are kind of wonderful and horrible all at the same time. I really love the one on the bottom right that combines the cobalt blue with the uranium green. In Austria, the Lutz factory uses it. We typically think about iridescence when we think of the Lutz factory, but uranium was a very important part of their palette. Of course, in Murano, all of the major Italian glass factories in Murano were using uranium. And in the United States, we think of Tiffany, we think of iridescence, we don't think of uranium, but they were heavy users, as were Boston and Sandwich and Steuben. Also incredibly important in architectural glazes. And so if you think about the typical bathroom decor from the 1920s to 1940s or so, those were often uranium or thorium glazed tiles. In terms of actual serious hazards, what we want to think about, though, is jewelry, and particularly necklaces. If you're like me and you collect a lot of Victorian jewelry, you want to make sure that you're not wearing a necklace that's giving off gamma rays, because that's actually going to wreak havoc on your thyroid. And Spike is going to speak to the degree of hazard involved in all these materials, but I wanted to point out the specific one. And just also mention Billy Bob Thornton's truly famous phobia of antiques that he brings up in a number of his interviews, and how horrified he would be if he knew the true story behind so much of the 19th century antiques that we're talking about today. And so I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for your attention, and happy Halloween.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm just gonna invite Spike to come on camera with us now, and I'm just gonna say, would you like to respond? Tell us more things that you know.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderfully diverse presentation, brilliantly coloured, and also Emily and Nadia for making it all happen. Jennifer has talked about three particular groups of pigments: lead-based, arsenic-based, and uranium-based. And I've scribbled some notes as she went along. And I would like to really split my response in two. I'd like to talk a little bit about arsenic and lead together, and then I want to talk about a little bit about uranium, and then I'll hand back to you, Jennifer. And I wanted to split this into arsenic and lead being separate from uranium, because they have always been known to be poisons, whereas uranium hasn't. And if we go back to the 19th century, we get the terrible feeling that these kind of artist materials were incredibly bad news, which indeed they were. But if you stop at the 19th century, as you go back, you might get the impression that things have improved, and they have improved a bit. But if you go backwards in time, things might even get worse. But I would actually say that that's a false impression. So I want to go earlier back than the 19th century. And the problem is not really, as Jennifer has suggested a number of times, the problem is not really the pigments. It is the economic environment in which they're used. And that became particularly bad in the 19th century. So if we go back, just looking at arsenic, arsenic's been in use for about 4,000 years as an artist's pigment. It was used 2,000 years before Christ in ancient Egypt. They were predominantly using the yellow and the orange and the red versions of arsenic. And in fact, these changed colors, and because the symbolism was very specific. You didn't want a red to change into a yellow or a yellow to turn into a red. And they knew how to control the rate of change of color. And it was involving particle sizes. So they were taking dust, which Jennifer has said is the dangerous form of a pigment, and grading this dust into different sizes. But I don't think they were killed by it. Now, that's just a hunch, because there's not much good documentation about the health of ancient Egyptian artists 4,000 years ago. But if we look at other ways in which artists have used materials since then, we get an impression that actually they knew what they were doing and they could protect themselves. So, for example, orpiment and realgar are carried on being used all the way through European painting. And in particular, in the 17th century, in Dutch flower paintings, the yellow center of a flower is likely to be orpiment. And if you look at it today, it might look a bit disappointing because actually that orpiment has gone off. It's turned into a brown, lost its color. But they were using it and they were not dying from it. And we know this because there are economic surveys of occupations of people in the Low Countries in the 17th century. And we have data about things like life expectancy. And the life expectancy of a painter in 17th century Low Countries was 64. So they actually bucked quite a lot of trends. Artists tended to outlive peasants who worked in the fields, and they also outlived the aristocracy. And they managed to do that despite the fact that they lived in towns and urban rates of mortality were higher than rural rates of mortality. So they knew what they were doing. And women artists lived longer than men artists. So the things that Jennifer is talking about, exposure to dust, licking your brush to sharpen the point and stuff like that, that's not a practice that we see before the 19th century. They knew how dangerous it was because artists were very closely connected professionally to alchemists. And alchemists also had an interest in orpiment because it was one of the things that went towards making gold or trying to make gold. So there was a knowledge of these materials. So that's dealing with arsenic, yes, very poisonous, but didn't necessarily kill people, except in the contexts that Jennifer's been talking about. If we think about lead, its history of use is the same. It's about 4,000 years, used in Mesopotamia, in ancient Greece, in Rome. The way of making it as a pigment, which is a white powder in paint, is slightly different chemically from the white powder that goes into a glaze, but just as potentially poisonous. The recipes are pretty unchanged from Aristotle all the way through to the 18th century. Well, no, sorry, the 19th century. But the health issues associated with them change over time. The way in which you make it is you take lead metal, you coil it, a sheet of it, you coil it, you sprinkle it with urine and vinegar, and you leave it under horse manure. And this sounds like an unlikely way of getting the purest white on the artist's palette, but that's how it was made. And as long as it was made by the artists themselves, it was knowledge that they had and they could do it safely. The problem is when we have a division of labor, which happens when you scale up industries, and then you have workers in ignorance, as Jennifer showed, those poor children working at home with their mother or with serious poisons on the kitchen table. And we know very, just as I gave you a statistical thing about 17th century Dutch painters, we know artists, how they worked. I, for example, worked on a painting by Titian, Perseus and Andromeda, and it's very evident that he had a problem with the background, which includes a sea monster, because in X-ray, we see lead white being smeared all over it to then paint over it. But he didn't do it with a brush, he did it with his hand. And we can see that he was quite frustrated. You've got these angry marks and fingerprints of where his hand is in lead. But he didn't die of lead poisoning. He died of plague, aged in his late 80s, as a healthy, successful businessman who was running a very, very high-powered studio. So it's about it's about knowing how you relate to a material rather than what that material is, and that's very different from uranium, which is why I wanted to deal with it separately. Uranium we think of as bad, quite rightly, because it's a radiation hazard. If we do word association with that, then things come into our minds like Hiroshima, 3 Mile Island, and we know the radiation hazards associated with that. But they didn't know it when they were using it. For the first 100 years of uranium's existence, there was no such thing as radioactivity, or it was not known. And when it was discovered, it was actually used for health. It was meant to be good for rheumatism. So we have to, when we look back at previous uses of materials, try and forget what we know about those materials to some extent and think about, well, what did they know about those materials? And obviously, we know arsenic's poisonous. In the 19th century, the people who had to deal with it either didn't know or were, as Jennifer says, very stoic about working with death. But before that, people did know and had adequate ways of dealing with it. But if you want to think about what did uranium mean to the people who were making uranium glass before Hiroshima and 3 Mile Island, then it's not difficult because it's in the name. The name uranium comes from the name of the planet Uranus, because they were discovered very close to each other. And the name of Uranus as a planet was originally, it was going to be called Georgius Sidus, which means the Star of George, in the realm, because it was discovered in the reign of George III. But that was over, but they had a big argument, and no, they came up with Uranus. And Uranus is the Greek god of the sky. Now, what they're doing there is following a tradition which links the planets to the metals. So uranium is a very, very traditional idea behind it. Lead was linked to the planet Saturn, gold is linked to the sun, silver is linked to the moon. And uranium is following in that tradition, which means that people's thoughts about uranium were that it was an integral part, connected to the rest of the universe. But as Jennifer very rightly said, and I thought it was a very good point, a lot of green in interior decoration is a romantic idea of trying to reconnect with nature, which you've become divorced from. This is, uranium is a very good example of how divorced we have become from nature. So I wanted to just, I realize I've talked maybe too much, say, yes, these are poisonous, but you're not necessarily poisoned by them. It is the context in which it's your relationship with it which determines whether you're poisoned. So at that point, I want to stop, give somebody else a chance.
Jen, do you have anything you'd want to say in response? And I know there are further slides, so I don't know if you want to show some visuals that will kind of thematically transition us conversationally.
Sure. I mean, one of the things I think Spike did an excellent job of taking us back in time and thinking about what did people know, when did they know it, and using that to explain how they interacted with these materials. And in a way, I feel like the big elephant in the room in terms of what changes in the 19th century is laissez-faire capitalism. And that's why we see people in intimate contact with these materials who don't understand them, versus when you think about the millennia before, where people were in intimate contact with these materials, but they were experts. Yeah. So having said that, I want to kind of put this all into perspective in terms of what capitalism is offering us today in the way of brightly colored materials. And Spike, did you want to start here with sugar and vapes?
Well, I just thought that it was, because Majolica is and uranium glass, there's a lot of tableware, we ought to think about food. And if we think about poisons in the utensils that we have for food, we also ought to recognize that poison is in food. And it's a cultural thing to either ignore or highlight. And sugar is an extraordinary poison with an equally, if we think about the slave trade and how sugar industry grew, with an equally dark past. And we, funnily enough, accept it culturally. So there are political choices here about what we decide is or isn't a poison. And that just made me, whilst you were talking, Jennifer, where you showed examples of bosses blaming workers for their ill health, and saying that if they weren't dirty, they wouldn't be unhealthy. And that made me think of, how do we define a poison? What is a poison? If a poison is a very floaty idea, that sugar's not a poison, of course, but arsenic is a poison. It made me think of Mary Douglas's definition of what dirt was. In the 1960s, the anthropologist Mary Douglas said dirt was, and her phrase was, matter out of place. And I thought that was really, well, this is recognized to be a really good definition of what dirt is. Dirt isn't an absolute, it's a relative. Everything has a proper place. And when it's in a proper place, it's not dirty. And when it's not in a proper place, it is dirty. So for example, because of COVID, I'm working from home today, and we share our house with a dog, and he has hair. And when he scratches or shakes, the hair leaves the dog and ends up in a rug, in a carpet, or in a tumbleweed-like thing that rolls around the kitchen floor until I sweep it up or vacuum. Now, what was as a material part of a creature I loved becomes dirt just by being moved. And that idea of actually dirt being matter out of place made me think what poison is. And poison is actually, I think, matter out of balance. Because all of these things, arsenic, uranium, lead, these are all natural materials. And in balance, they do not pose a threat to us. And if we maintain balance through intelligence as craftspeople, which Titian did, they're not a threat to him. They only become a threat to us when they become out of balance. And they're out of balance. And Jennifer's picture of the Stoke, slag heaps and stuff was horrifying. That is seriously out of balance. And that out of balanceness comes from capitalism, concentrating materials, concentrating money, concentrating people, and creating very unhealthy relationships between things.
There's such an interesting sort of visual paradox here that you're sort of talking about. We think about Majolica as this sort of incredibly colorful, distracting, spectacular piece of ceramic ware, especially when it was made into sort of sculpture pieces. And then I'm thinking about like a really amazingly decorated birthday cake. you know, you have this visual paradox where it's so seductive in what it looks like, and then you have this other underbelly that comes with a dark cultural history as well. So, you know, we're still grappling with lead in America. There's still not clean water in parts of this country, and lead exposure in New York City in public housing is incredibly common and still a big problem for children. And so it's just this really interesting, and I think there's something that I think, Spike, you've mentioned in the past when we've talked about this program, and Jen, you agree that there's something here about gender as well when we think about these materials. I'm wondering if either of you want to just talk a little bit more about that, the sort of gendering of things.
Can I? Yeah, I'll be very quick on this because I know our time is running out. But we're talking about materials, and I tried to suggest how we could think about uranium by saying it's related to Uranus, which is the god of the sky. It's a different way of thinking about it rather than thinking it's what goes into weapons of mass destruction. And we just need to think of the word matter to know that it's related to mother in Latin. And there is a gendered thing there, that the earth as Earth Mother is something which is abused, violated, and used as a resource for creating these wonderful materials.
Jen, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to pick up on something that Spike said that I thought was really important, which is that we are surrounded all day, every day by these materials. And if you have granite countertops, for example, granite has a fair bit of uranium and thorium in it, or if your house is built on granite, you can measure it, but it doesn't have deleterious effects, because it's only when the material is dug out of the ground and concentrated and then handled improperly in an industrial environment, and workers are not given the proper safety protocols where things go wrong. But I do think about capitalism in terms of trying to pull you in with, in the case of this particular slide, brightly colored and highly addictive things at a young age, and blaming the victim is something that we really saw in the 19th century. And boy, is that true of sugar. It's like, oh, we'll just stop eating so much without any acknowledgement of how much sugar is put into American food, where it does not belong in items like bread or ketchup or tomato sauce. And the fact that the tobacco industry is introducing these brightly colored vapes when people are younger. And so I just wanted to think a little bit about our sort of environmental catastrophe that we're facing right now in terms of plastics and their endurance in the environment, and how they were sold in the 1950s and 60s, this incredible techno-optimism. And this is very much something that was directed at women. And so just like we saw in the 19th century, that the emerald green fashion was directed at women as well. And so women were seen as an economic force that was going to help to make these new capitalist enterprises successful. And so something that I like to think about in terms of our future is, if something seems very brightly colored and inexpensive and ubiquitous, maybe try to think about it in terms of what somebody's trying to sell you and what the long-term consequences are.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about. I feel like what both of you are saying is really complicating this notion of progress. You know, as a society, we're like, oh, sure, progression of ideas. There's a lot that we should be grateful for in terms of thinking that we have, in terms of frameworks and thinking about power. But at the same time, there's a lot of loss that's happened between now and the 19th century in terms of our relationship to materials.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I would say that there is some progress, but there is a lot of continuity. And one of the great things about looking at something historical, as Jennifer has done, is to see how people have responded to particular kind of situations. And I was, I won't say thrilled, but in a kind of bad way I was, by Jennifer's exposure of William Morris being the owner of or part owner of an arsenic mine, who was an arsenic denier. Now, it struck me he was doing exactly the same as the people who grew tobacco, who denied the poisonous nature of tobacco. And I have to say, exactly the same as the oil companies who yesterday or the day before were dragged in to be questioned about whether they had anything to do with global warming. We are seeing the same things being repeated and repeated, and looking at how those things are being repeated, I think really raises the solution to this, which is education. And I really have to applaud the Bard for having the imagination to talk about Majolica in a way that is relevant to something like plastic pollution and climate change and poisoning by sugar. Thank you.
Great. I mean, it's 1:02, so I'm going to move over to our Q&A and sort of start cherry picking a couple of those questions. We might not get through everyone's questions because I think we're going to try and close out at 1:15. But I'm going to just throw them at you, and whoever wants to answer can. So the question at the top, I think, is a relatively short answer, but are these very bright colors no longer available even with modern technology, or have the colors just fallen out of favor? Maybe that's a Jen question.
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to start with that one. You could go out if you wanted to and buy all of these arsenic and antimony and lead and cadmium containing pigments predominantly through one company, Kramer Pigment, which operates in New York City and in Berlin. And so there is still this one company making them. They're rare. You'd have to, as an artist, have a really good reason for wanting to work with these materials. Not that there aren't, we couldn't do a whole other program on modern artist materials and the problems with those materials. Some of the other materials that we showed, like the pink of the Majolica, is actually still, that's a chrome tin pink, still very much in use today. And so not all of this technology is outdated technology. Great,
thank you. I think this is also a quick answer. There's a lot of sort of detailed questions here. So I think a lot of people associate lead as a gray material, and we see it in its sort of like solid form. And so the question here is about what the white is. It's, yeah, go ahead.
The white is an oxide, so the metal is a dark color, but if it rusts in some form, some way, it can create a number of different colors. And this is one of the things that I find interesting about looking at materials from a pre-modern point of view, because the fact that you had a black metal that created a white rust was seen as something with mystical significance. And the idea, if you can imagine the yin and yang diagram, that each thing contains the seed of its opposite. A black thing will have white within it, just as silver, when it tarnishes, is a white metal. It will then turn black. And these are nice philosophical ideas that helped people relate to pigments and not and materials, and not be alienated from them in the way we have become.
Thank you. This is more of a comment, I think, but I think the answer is yes. But these colors are very bright, as are the colors of, for example, the poison dart frog, coral snake, various mushrooms. I think it's like, what's the connection there other than commonality?
I mean, there are some connections. And when I said that I didn't think that ancient Egyptian painters poisoned themselves, you know, I don't have any proof of that. But we see that really historically, there's a great deal of very, very, very good observation of nature. And if you look at ethnographic work now, you can see how indigenous cultures have actually got an incredibly good insight into nature. And so color is one of those indicators of what is significant. It might be significant because it's very good for you, but it might also be significant because it's very bad for you. But you'd work it out pretty quickly. And that's not just to do with color, it's also to do with smell. So Jennifer mentioned smog and smoke. Sulfur smells appalling because it's a natural poison that you are likely to come across. And so your body warns you about it. And we tend to overlook those warnings.
Great. Yeah. So an attunement to nature is perhaps,
yeah.
Again, when we're talking about this idea of loss, I think it's worth highlighting. Jen, do you want to offer anything else?
Certainly, when I think about ancient Egyptian art, I think about how challenging it is for us to imagine the geochemical environment of someone in ancient Egypt and the mineral resources that they would have had available to them versus what we have available to us today, where so many of what would have been surface deposits are completely mined out. And so I totally agree with what Spike was saying, that that bright color of that rock would tell you this is something important. It could be something bad, it could be something good, but you don't know until you do that experiment with it.
There's a fact check question here, or that beautiful, or I think beautiful, not everyone would, definitely not Billy Bob, but the green room that you had in that final slide, there's a question of where is that room? And is it possible to see that interior?
Oh gosh, I believe that room is in Brooklyn, and that the most, at least from my limited perspective, the most important aesthetic era rooms that I've seen in the United States have been in Brooklyn townhouses.
Great. So Brooklyn townhouse. A question about the uranium glass necklace. I'm going to direct this one to you, Jen. How radioactive is a uranium glass necklace, and can you estimate the level near the head in terms of standard sea level cosmic radiation background? I don't understand what I just said, but I'm hoping you do.
It's interesting because, and this is something that I didn't get into at all in terms of the amount of uranium that you need to get that brilliant yellow-green color in the glass, but it's not that much. And depending upon the setting that you're using on your Geiger counter, you can make the Geiger counter basically scream and seem as though all this radioactivity is coming off it. But in fact, a lot of what's happening with uranium is alpha particles, which can be blocked by a piece of paper, or beta particles, which can be blocked by, for example, half an inch of plexiglass. And it's the gamma rays that really are penetrating and are bad for you. But really the exact radioactivity of a specific piece of jewelry is going to depend on how much uranium the glassmaker decided to use. So a little bit of a non-answer, but that's the closest I can get.
But also, you know, don't wear a necklace like that every day for 20 years. Even now is the advice on that one. Okay, great. This is a question that's coming up all the time for us. Actually, all of our gallery educators are answering this question on the gallery floor, but can we use antique food-related Majolica tableware today? Is it safe? Can you eat off it?
All right. I can start with this one and then Spike can take over, but absolutely, you can eat off of lead glazes, and the food is not in contact with the lead for very long. And really what you want to not do is store objects in lead glasses or lead glazes, particularly if they're acidic. If they've got a low pH, then that's going to leach the lead from the glass or the glaze out into the food. And you can, even if you wanted to, eat or drink out of uranium glasses, and you're not going to be exposed to any, a large enough amount of radioactivity to do any damage. And so, yes, you can absolutely use these materials.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I would back that up, basically, I told you about Titian painting with lead white using his hands. If he'd done that with, I'm getting feedback, this is odd. If he'd done that with powder, he'd have been in real trouble. But if you have a paint, the powder is actually embedded within a medium, and that medium is protective. So he was handling lead that was within oil. And when you're looking at Majolica or glass, you're looking at lead within glass. And the way in which nuclear waste is stored, or one of the ways in which nuclear waste is stored, is to put it in glass to make it safe. So yes, they're certainly safe.
Great. And then just a note here from our exhibition designer, David Harvey, that Spike, your good point about sugar was echoed in the Power of Poison exhibition at the AMNH in 2013, 2014, which I will see if I can copy and paste that link into the chat for everybody right now. I can, perfect. Okay, we have maybe a couple more minutes. Okay, there's a question here about sort of the miners and the health risks and hazards to folks who were producing these materials. So those mining them, those transporting them. Spike, I'm guessing this is a question I would send over to you. Okay. Anything known on that front?
Yes. If you go back, I mean, I've got this bad habit of going back to Pliny and people like that, but they will talk about the miasma in the mine, which is the evil air. So they're aware of it then. But we don't even have to think about just the people who mine and transport these things. I mentioned uranium as something that brings to mind Hiroshima and 3 Mile Island. Well, if you live in Northern Ontario, it brings to mind the contamination of the First Nation Serpent River, an entire area that has been decimated by the waste from uranium mines. So it's not just the people who mine it, it's the people who live near it as well who suffer.
Yeah, and I would add that, you know, the bomb testing in the American Southwest, uranium mining in the American Southwest as well, large swaths of the Navajo Nation totally polluted by that practice. Yeah.
We're still very much dealing with that now. Oh, sorry, Emily.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Jen.
Sure. A lot of what's happening in the Navajo region now is that the fallout, sorry, bad choice of words, but people would take the mine tailings from the uranium mines, which the vast majority were located on Navajo land, and use them to make buildings, and not realizing that then they were making really a fairly radioactive structure. And so they're going in and having to remove a lot of buildings from Navajo land as a result of this. And Navajo are still exposed to, I think, at least 3 times the radiation in their environment than you would be, you know, at sea level in New York City as a result of so much mining having taken place on their land.
Yeah, so I mean, what we're talking about here is the intersection of like systemic and environmental racism that is still alive and well in the US, and I'm sure in other parts of the world as well. Thank you for that question, the person that asked that. Okay, let me scale. Let me find if there's a nice one to end on. Okay, this is sort of I'm going to squash a few questions together, but there's a question here about these, you know, marveling at the beauty of these colors and asking if we've been sort of created non-toxic versions, I guess, so synthetic, one might say synthetic versions. And then I guess the next question here is there regulation responding to some of these questions now that we would want to flag in terms of the health of workers and consumers? Like, sorry, this is a big one, actually. The history of regulation is huge. And I think maybe we just need to leave that one aside, because yes, the lead led exposure during Majolica did lead to big labor changes in the UK around workers' safety. But I would say that no, we're not regulating enough around worker safety in all corners of capitalism. But Spike, I saw you animate, so go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say it doesn't really matter if you regulate in one country, if you then outsource the work to another country in which there is no regulation. So we've got, you know, again, you were talking about a racist side to this. We've got differences between the so-called developed world and developing world.
I think that sometimes we make a mistake thinking about the Industrial Revolution as something that has happened. It is something that is still very much happening in China, very much happening in India and Southeast Asia, and where they're dealing with so many of these same problems that we dealt with in the 19th century. And we see the new artist pigments that are coming up, which are mostly organic pigments made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, rather than heavy metals. They're untested. We don't know yet what their long-term effects are going to be.
Great. So, I mean, it's a somber note to leave this on, but I guess maybe the one to end this on is that, you know, I hope that folks are leaving this program with more of attunement to thinking about where the materials that they engage with on a daily basis come from, and that perhaps that kind of awareness will help us as we navigate this environmental disaster that we as humans have put in motion. And that a kind of getting back to material is perhaps an answer to thinking about how to be more conscious of the impact our consuming is having on the world around us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Well, thank you so much, Jen and Spike. This has been fantastic. And for those of you that want to share this program with friends or students or colleagues, it will be going on the BGC YouTube channel in a couple of weeks with edited captions. So all is not lost. There is a record of this program and it will be online shortly. Thank you so much. Any final words, Jen, Spike, before we close out?
Just happy Halloween again.
Yeah, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.